I'm back on YouTube Live. Finally, my computer's working and I can do YouTube Live again, so this is very exciting. Normally, when we think of terrible presidents, they're terrible both domestic policy wise and foreign policy wise. So, George Walker Bush, 43rd President of the United States, he was horrible in that he started the war in Afghanistan, failed to capture bin Laden, even though he was literally offered a deal on a platter. And Bush stayed in Afghanistan because he wanted to exploit the natural resources of Afghanistan and have a geopolitical dominance in that area. George Walker Bush also lied, flat out lied the country into a war, illegal offensive invasion of Iraq, and killed so many civilians. George Walker Bush also torpedoed all relations with North Korea and totally destroyed diplomacy with North Korea and made relations so much worse. George Walker Bush also did torture, massive war crimes, spying, and domestically, George W. Bush, as I said, did spying, and he did the tax cuts for the wealthy and massive deregulation, which caused the 2007 recession. And George Walker Bush also did the No Child Left Behind Act, which was really just the Every Child Left Behind Act, horrible for public education and teachers and students. And George Walker Bush. So basically, you get the gist. We could go on about George W. Bush because he was one of the worst presidents ever. And the point is, his foreign policy, horrendous. Domestic policy, awful. Likewise with Barack Obama. Barack Obama bailed out the Wall Street criminals who helped cause the Great Recession. Barack Obama did a Republican health care plan, which gave more power to the private insurance companies. And of course, that plan was, he got the plan from the Heritage Foundation, but it was actually created by Richard Nixon. And Barack Obama also massively increased drone strikes, killing 90% civilians, did some horrible interventionism in Libya. Barack Obama raised tensions with North Korea and tried to install that nuclear missile system in South Korea to point at China and Russia and raise tensions even more over there. Barack Obama stayed in Afghanistan, did a surge. Barack Obama got back into Iraq. And basically, so Barack Obama was horrible on domestic policy and foreign policy. And since I brought up Richard Nixon, I mean, do we really need to go through him? He overthrew the leftist government of Chile, Salvador Allende, and installed a dictatorship. He did a genocide in Cambodia. He started the war on drugs domestically. He did segregated busing. He did this other strategy, fully integrated the racist Southerners into the Republican Party. We can go on and on. Tried to nuke North Korea. He also was responsible for spying, doing a blacklist list of enemies, keeping track of people, massive abuses of power. Honestly, with Richard Nixon, oh yeah, and he sabotaged peace talks in Vietnam before he became president. But so basically, Richard Nixon also horrible domestically and foreign policy wise. Donald Trump, massive tax cut to the wealthy, massive deregulation, favors for the predatory payday loan industry, destruction of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the assassination of the top Iranian general Qasem Soleimani, pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal, bungling peace talks with North Korea because Donald Trump was listening to John Bolton and Donald Trump didn't actually change any of the policies on North Korea. Like he should have lifted sanctions and pulled the troops out of South Korea, but he didn't do that. Instead, he said how much he was in love with Kim, but like, okay, if you're in love with him, well, then why don't you change the policies and be like more diplomatic and non-interventionist? But no, he didn't do that. So wars without action are dead. But basically, he also was very hawkish with Russia, escalated with Russia, sold weapons to Ukraine, and did a lot. So based on Trump, also horrible domestically and foreign policy wise. But what about presidents who are only horrible on domestic policy, but mostly good on foreign policy? Or what about presidents who are only horrible on foreign policy and mostly good on domestic policy? Well, that's a tough one. So let's go through three examples of each kind. So, Calvin Coolidge, Herbert Hoover, Grover Cleveland, Calvin Coolidge, Herbert Hoover. The 22nd and 24th president, non-consecutive president, Grover Cleveland, 30th president, Calvin Coolidge, and 31st president, Herbert Hoover. Their domestic policies were absolutely horrendous. Grover Cleveland hated unions, hated workers, hated the working class, and he used the military to suppress a labor strike, a railroad strike, a Pullman railroad strike to be specific. And Grover Cleveland also supported Jim Crow, viewed African Americans as inferior, was massively xenophobic, and engaged in just horrible policies all around. Rejected veterans' pensions and refused to help out farmers who were suffering from a drought. And in terms of the cumulative record of Grover Cleveland's domestic policy, he's viewed as the most conservative Democrat, pretty much of all time, most conservative Democrat to be president. Okay, maybe not as conservative as the ones before the Civil War, but point is, incredibly horrible on domestic policy. Using the military to suppress the strike is a no-no. But in terms of foreign policy, Grover Cleveland refused to annex Hawaii. Remember, Hawaii was a kingdom and it was overthrown by the United States under President Benjamin Harrison, but Grover Cleveland came in and refused to annex Hawaii. And Grover Cleveland also kicked the British out of South America, because not completely out of South America. What I mean is the British were trying to take land away from Venezuela, so Grover Cleveland stepped in and he told them to go away, and he helped out Venezuela in that area. And Grover Cleveland also refused to exploit Africa. So Grover Cleveland was a non-interventionist on foreign policy, and his foreign policy was really good, even though, as I mentioned, his domestic policy was horrible. So horrible domestic policy, great foreign policy. Likewise, Calvin Coolidge, domestically, he was horrible. He also hated unions. Calvin Coolidge did. Hated unions, hated the working class, suppressed unions. And he also cut taxes on the wealthy, did massive deregulation, small government conservatism. Calvin Coolidge was basically the Ronald Reagan of the 1920s. And Calvin Coolidge was president during the Roaring '20s, and his policies were what caused the Great Depression, which happened under the next president, Herbert Hoover. But we'll get to Herbert Hoover in a minute. But Calvin Coolidge was doing all that horrible stuff domestically, acting like Ronald Reagan on domestic policy. But on foreign policy, Calvin Coolidge actually cut military spending. Calvin Coolidge cut military spending, which was really good and a non-interventionist move. And on other matters of foreign policy, he was relatively non-interventionist. So horrendous domestic policy, but actually pretty decent foreign policy. Like, you would never hear of any Republican or Democrat cutting. And Calvin Coolidge was a Republican, by the way. You would never hear of any Republican or Democrat wanting to cut military spending these days. They only want to raise it more and more, and it's gargantuous. But when is Coolidge cut military spending? So credit to him, right? Right? We'll get to that in a minute, though. How much credit we should be giving to people, or how much. Yes, but next, moving on, 31st President Herbert Hoover. He was also a Republican, and under him, the Great Depression began. And so he handled it by doing more deregulation, raising taxes on the middle class, working class, making World War I veterans homeless. And Herbert Hoover's domestic policies were exactly that of Ronald Reagan and George Bush and Donald Trump and all of them. And so Herbert Hoover's domestic policies were horrendous, terrible. But on foreign policy, he refused to intervene in Latin America. He did other non-interventionist things, like pursuing disarmament, not weaponizing, in fact, de-weaponizing. And he refused to get involved when Japan attacked Manchuria, although obviously Japan attacking Manchuria is absolutely horrible. but Herbert Hoover refused to get actually involved in the war, but he kept a good balance by not recognizing the territories that Japan annexed. So Herbert Hoover was very cautious on foreign policy and did a good job being a non-interventionist. After And we really have to give credit to these non-interventionist presidents because it's a really brave thing to do, especially when most American presidents, every single post-World War II president is a war criminal, and the vast majority of the presidents before World War II were also war criminals, and they all love imperialism and expansionism and all that horrible stuff. So to really be different and stand out in some ways is a good thing. So for that, they should get credit. But we'll get to the overall evaluation in a minute. Now we get to the presidents who were horrible foreign policy wise, but great domestically. So Ulysses Grant, Harry Truman, Lyndon Johnson, Ulysses S. Grant, the 18th President of the United States, Harry S. Truman, the 33rd President of the United States, and Lyndon Johnson, the wonderful, or maybe horrible, we'll see in a minute as we go through his policies, 36th President of the United States, of course. So Grant, Republican, Truman, Democrat, Johnson, Democrat. So you see how in one category I had one Democrat and two Republicans, and in this category I have one Republican, two Democrats. So it's very bipartisan, you know. By the way, bipartisanship is really depends on the substance of what you're doing. So, but we'll get to that in a minute because bipartisanship is not inherently bad or good. It depends on the policy. It always depends on the specific policy. But let's go through some of the foreign policies. So Ulysses Grant, horrible on foreign policy in that he wanted to annex the Dominican Republic, or what is now known as the Dominican Republic. It was called Santo Domingo back then. So Ulysses Grant, apparently in private, thought that the Dominican Republic, or Santo Domingo as it was called back then, could be a place where some African Americans who were facing persecution during Reconstruction could be safe. And he also, or that was apparently what he thought in private. I mean, who knows what he really thought in private, because it matters what your public positions are and what policies you actually take and do. So the other reason was Ulysses Grant wanted geopolitical dominance. He wanted to make sure that no European country would take over the Santo Domingo. Ulysses Grant wanted the natural resources and the good pathway and the geographical advantages that came with Santo Domingo. So that's why he wanted to annex it, and that's a interventionist type thinking. It's really bad. So he wanted to annex another place that the United States had no business annexing. Now, it failed. The resolution to annex that place failed. It didn't go through. But it shows you his interventionist thinking. And he also wanted to assimilate Native Americans into white culture, which is horrible. So he did end up killing some Native Americans and doing bad things there. Now, of course, Native Americans is really domestic policy, but the overall arching theme of Ulysses Grant's domestic policy, first of all, Ulysses Grant's foreign policy, absolutely horrible, as I just described. He literally tried to annex Santo Domingo. But in domestic policy, he was really good. He fought hard for civil rights, and he was a big champion and advocate of civil rights. And Ulysses Grant also he used the Insurrection Act to crush, decimate, and destroy the KKK. Ulysses Grant was so effective at dealing with the Ku Klux Klan that they just cowered in fear of him, and Ulysses Grant punished the KKK for the horrible things they were doing to African Americans. And so Ulysses Grant was great on domestic policy. Of course, then we would have to go through the corruption scandals in his administration with his vice president, Schuyler Colfax, taking bribes and everything. But the point is, Ulysses Grant was trying to do a horrible thing on foreign policy with the attempted annexation of Santo Domingo, but he was mostly good on domestic policy with his support for civil rights and his how he destroyed the KKK. And of course, the only other president who was so effective and monumental in crushing the KKK was Lyndon Johnson, but more on him later. Harry S. Truman, in terms of foreign policy, created the CIA. Harry Truman created the CIA. Harry Truman created the CIA. I'm saying that 3 times because creating the CIA is the worst war crime of all time. And foreign policy wise, the CIA has been the agent, the root of the best way to facilitate horrible foreign policy post World War II, is the way I'm going to put it. So, foreign policy wise, Harry Truman was relatively terrible. Of course, you don't have to add in the fact that during the Korean War, Harry Truman refused to nuke China because he didn't want to get the Soviet Union into the war as well. So that was a good decision, and he fired the lunatic Douglas MacArthur. So that was also good. But overall, foreign policy-wise, Harry Truman is the one who created the CIA. Now he apologized for it later, and he said how much he regretted it and how he didn't realize what it would be used to do. I think it was a Washington Post article or some article. He wrote that article after he was president, and so he understood that what he did was wrong. So it's good that he apologized, but still he shouldn't have done it. And foreign policy-wise, he was bad. But in terms of domestic policy, oh, and of course, Harry Truman escalated tensions with the Soviet Union and really just kicked off the Cold War, so that's really bad too. But so his foreign policy was relatively terrible, but domestic policy, Harry Truman was pretty awesome. Supported civil rights, supported labor unions, really vetoed right to work laws. And when the Republicans overrode his veto, Harry Truman campaigned on that and said, I'm Harry Truman, I'm going to fight for you. I'm not going to let these SOB Republicans take away your workers' rights. And you get me to win the presidential election in 1948, and I'm going to keep fighting for your workers' rights. And we are going to help unions, make them stronger, and materially deliver for workers. And also, we're going to give you universal health care. I created a universal health care plan that the Republicans are blocking right now, and so are the conservative blue dog Democrats. But we're going to get universal health care. We're going to give health care to everyone. And we're going to have civil rights. I integrated the military. So at Harry Truman, his domestic policy was pretty solid, even though his foreign policy was bad. Now we move on to Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Baines Johnson. So we did Ulysses S. Grant, Harry S. Truman. By the way, the S in Harry Truman stands for nothing because it's just an initial. But long story short, but let's get back to the policy. Let's get back on topic. So Ulysses S. Grant, Lyndon B. Johnson. So Lyndon Baines Johnson dropped 7.5 million bombs on Vietnam, expanded the war into Indochina, killed lots of civilians in Vietnam, and Lyndon Johnson, I'm saying that because their policies are actually pretty similar, and you'll see why. Lyndon Johnson invaded the Dominican Republic to quell what he feared was a democratic uprising. Lyndon Johnson was very supportive of Israel in its early stages and gave them lots of money for their territories and illegal settlements. Lyndon Johnson supported military dictatorships across the world and was pretty horrible on foreign policy. Horrendous foreign policy, to say the least. Now, foreign policy, Lyndon B. Johnson acted like George W. Bush. Let's keep it real. And he also, not to mention the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which effectively he just gave himself illegal war powers. So Lyndon Johnson's foreign policy, absolutely horrendous, full of carnage. But Lyndon Johnson's domestic policy, he increased immigration, got rid of racial quotas using the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. He did great things for immigrants. Lyndon B. Johnson, also Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, Higher Education Act, supported universal health care, literally created Medicare Act. The point is, Lyndon Johnson's domestic policy, to summarize, were pretty awesome. And LBJ was basically FDR domestically. Great Society was a continuation of what the New Deal was. So that's great. Except his foreign policy was terrible. Domestically great, foreign policy terrible. So now so as I summarized the policies, okay, yeah, I'm seeing this, sorry for the interruption, but there's a YouTube notification telling me my connection is unstable. So, but I see the timer's still going, so I guess I'm good. I hope this is recording and I'm being able to be heard. So honestly, this technology thing is really annoying me, but it's the only way I can upload YouTube videos. So let's keep going. So I think, yeah, as I was saying about how Cleveland, Coolidge, Hoover, horrible domestic policy, great foreign policy. Grant, Truman, Johnson, Lyndon, that is, horrible foreign policy, great domestic policy. So the point of this whole video is that you need to judge everything on its own. And what I mean by that is you have to give credit where credit is due. Like when when President Biden pulled out of Afghanistan, ended the occupation, give him credit because he did the right thing. Well, when President Biden doesn't pull out of Iraq, you criticize him because he's doing the wrong thing. Or when President Biden put sanctions on Afghanistan, you criticize him because that's horrible. When President Biden totally bungled Build Back Better and totally bungled other domestic policies, you criticize him because he's doing the wrong thing. When Dwight, so yeah, point is you have to evaluate everything on its own. So obviously Cleveland should be criticized for using the military to suppress workers' rights, but he should receive praise for not annexing Hawaii. And likewise, Ulysses Grant should be praised for supporting civil rights and crushing the KKK, but he should be criticized for attempting to annex Santo Domingo. Get the point? So now we can also make overall policy judgments. So we might say, since Calvin Coolidge's small government tax cuts for the rich deregulatory policy caused the Great Depression, and Herbert Hoover mishandled the Great Depression by cutting tax on the rich and doing more deregulation, raising taxes on working people, and lowering taxes for wealthy people. They are overall horrible presidents, but Calvin Coolidge still did a great thing when he cut military spending, and Herbert Hoover did a great thing when he tried to pursue disarmament and refused to intervene in Latin America and supported otherwise non-interventionist policies. Additionally, Lyndon Johnson was a Lyndon Johnson and Harry Truman were overall good presidents because they supported civil rights and supported universal health care. But otherwise, their foreign policy was massively destructive. And that should be criticized. So no one is above criticism, but no one is also below praise. So you have to evaluate policy by policy by policy by policy by policy, because what matters at the end of the day is the policy. What specifically are they doing? Now, just to recap, and I figure if you're watching my video, you're probably very smart, so you probably know how to judge people. Maybe you're terrible at it, maybe you're great at it, but you have some idea of how to do it, so use some common sense. Now, going back to what I was saying earlier, as I mentioned, George Walker Bush, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama, and Donald Trump, and Richard Nixon were horrible presidents, both domestically and foreign policy wise. And I just want to give one more example of a president who was horrible in terms of both domestic and foreign policy. Actually, we'll save that for the next video. And by the way, there's plenty of examples of presidents who are horrible domestically and foreign policy wise. But we'll save that. We'll save this thought for the next video. This video is long enough, 25 minutes. So actually 24 minutes and 57 seconds. Oh, now we're over 25 minutes. Yes, this video is pretty long enough, so we'll save my thought for the next video.